The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground where Sarah stood bound and beaten but unbroken in spirit, and the gathered crowd watched in heavy silence as the soldiers prepared their instruments of persuasion, and yet in her eyes there burned something fiercer than fear, something that spoke of dignity and choice and the freedom that lives in the human heart no matter what chains may bind the body. She had been captured 3 days prior when the cavalry found her living among the Apache people, and they could not understand why a woman of European descent would choose such a life, and they demanded she renounce her adopted family and return to what they called civilization. But Sarah knew better than they did what civilization truly meant, and she had found more of it in the generous hearts of the people who had taken her in than in all the fine houses and churches of her former world. 10 years had passed since the fever took her husband and infant son and left her hollow with grief, wandering without purpose through a world that suddenly seemed drained of all color and meaning, and in that darkness she had walked away from everything she knew, and somewhere in the vast desert she had collapsed and expected to die, and perhaps wanted to die, but instead she had awakened to find gentle hands tending her wounds and offering water and food without asking anything in return. The woman who found her was called Mourning Dove, and she had eyes that held both sorrow and joy in equal measure, as if she understood that life contained multitudes and that one emotion need not cancel out another. And she brought Sarah to her village, where the people regarded this stranger with curiosity but also with an openness that surprised her, and slowly day by day they taught her their ways and their language, and she began to learn what it meant to belong to something larger than yourself. There was Red Sky, who taught her to track animals by reading the stories written in disturbed earth and broken twigs, and he never grew impatient with her mistakes but instead laughed warmly and showed her again and again until her eyes learned to see what had always been invisible to her before. And there was Laughing Water, who taught her which plants could heal and which could harm, and how to gather them with respect and gratitude for the gifts they offered. And there was Swift River, the man who stood beside her, now also bound, also refusing to betray his people, also choosing dignity over safety, and she had not meant to love him, but love has its own wisdom and does not ask permission before taking root in the heart, and he had courted her in the old way with patience and small kindnesses and gifts that showed he paid attention to who she truly was and not who he wished her to be. The soldiers had caught them returning from gathering medicinal herbs in the hills, and they had demanded Swift River take them to the village and reveal where his people were hiding, and when he refused they beat him, and still he refused, and then they brought out Sarah, thinking perhaps they could use her to break his resolve, but they had not understood that she was no longer the frightened, grieving woman who had wandered into the desert all those years ago. The lieutenant in charge was a young man with hard eyes, and he clearly believed he was doing righteous work, bringing order to a lawless land and saving unfortunate souls from savagery, and he approached Sarah now with what he probably thought was kindness in his voice, and he told her she could end this suffering if she would only be reasonable and come home where she belonged. But Sarah looked at him with steady eyes and spoke clearly so all could hear, and she said, "This is my home and these are my people, and I will not betray them no matter what you do to me. And you call them savages, but they took in a broken stranger and asked nothing in return, and they shared their food when they had little, and they taught me that every living thing deserves respect, and they showed me that true wealth is measured not in gold or land but in the bonds between people who care for one another." The lieutenant's face hardened and he gestured to his men, and they raised their whips, and Sarah felt Swift River tense beside her, and she turned to look at him, and in his eyes she saw love and pride, and she knew that whatever came next they would face it together as they had faced everything since the day he first offered her his hand and his heart. The whip cracked through the air, but before it could fall an older man stepped forward from among the soldiers, and his weathered face spoke of many years and many hard lessons learned, and he held up his hand, and the soldier with the whip paused, and the older man approached the lieutenant and spoke to him in low urgent tones, and Sarah could not hear all the words, but she caught fragments about honor and orders and what kind of men they wanted to be. The lieutenant's jaw worked as if chewing on something bitter, and for a long moment no one moved, and the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out as it rode the thermal currents high above this small drama of human stubbornness and pride and principle. Then the old soldier stepped forward, and with his own knife he cut the bonds holding Sarah and Swift River, and he looked at them both and said quietly, "I had a daughter once, and she was about your age, and she died of fever, and every day I wonder what kind of world I am building for the children who remain, and today I think perhaps I can build something a little bit better than what I found." The lieutenant started to protest, but the old soldier cut him off and said, "These two are not prisoners of war, and they have broken no laws, and we have no right to hold them, and if you wish to continue this course you will do so without me, and I will report what I have seen here to the territorial governor, and we will see what he thinks of soldiers who torture women for the crime of choosing their own path." And something in his voice carried such weight of authority and conviction that the other soldiers began to shift uncomfortably and look away, and the lieutenant realized he had lost control of the moment and that sometimes the right thing and the expedient thing are not the same, and that day he would have to choose. He made a sharp gesture and turned away and said, "Take them out of my sight," and the old soldier nodded and helped Sarah and Swift River to their feet and offered them water from his canteen, and his hands were gentle as he tended the places where the ropes had cut into their skin. As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned to the old soldier and asked him his name, and he said, "I am called Thomas Webb, and I have been a soldier for 30 years, and I have done things I am proud of and things that haunt my dreams, and today I hope I have added something to the first column rather than the second." Sarah reached out and took his weathered hand in both of hers, and she said, "Thomas Webb, you have reminded me that there is goodness in all peoples, and that courage sometimes looks like an old soldier putting his career at risk to do what is right, and I will remember you in my prayers, and I will tell your story so that others might know there are still men who choose honor over obedience when the two come into conflict." They walked away then, she and Swift River, and they did not look back, and behind them the soldiers began to break camp, and the lieutenant stood alone staring at nothing and perhaps wondering how a simple morning had become so complicated, and whether he had shown wisdom or weakness, and not yet understanding that sometimes they are the same thing. The journey back to the village took 2 days, and Swift River's wounds troubled him, but he did not complain, and Sarah tended him with the herbs she had managed to keep hidden, and they spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable and full of understanding, and when they finally saw the familiar shapes of the wickiups in the distance, they both felt the weight lift from their shoulders. Mourning Dove saw them first, and she cried out, and the whole village came running, and there was joy and relief, and the children danced around them asking 1,000 questions, and the elders nodded gravely and said they had known Sarah and Swift River would return because they were strong in spirit and the bond between them was stronger than fear. That evening they sat around the fire, and Sarah told the story of what had happened, and when she spoke of Thomas Webb and his intervention there were murmurs of surprise and respect, because courage is recognized no matter what form it takes or what language it speaks, and Red Sky said that perhaps there was hope yet for peace if there were men like that among the soldiers. And Laughing Water said that Sarah had shown great courage too, because standing firm in the face of fear is not easy, and choosing principle over safety is a mark of true character, and that by refusing to break she had honored all of them and shown that she was truly one of the people in her heart if not in her blood. Swift River put his arm around Sarah and said nothing because his eyes said everything that needed saying, and she leaned against him and felt the warmth of the fire and the warmth of community and the warmth of belonging, and she thought about the long strange journey that had brought her to this place and this moment. She thought about Thomas Webb too and wondered what had become of him and whether he had faced consequences for his choice, and she hoped not, but knew that often doing the right thing comes with a cost, and she sent up a silent prayer that he would find peace and that his conscience would rest easy knowing he had acted with honor. The years that followed were not easy because tensions between the Apache people and the settlers continued to grow, and there were more conflicts and more losses, and eventually the time came when the village had to move deeper into the mountains to avoid the ever-encroaching boundaries of the reservation system. But through it all Sarah and Swift River remained together, and they had children who grew strong and proud knowing they belonged to two worlds and could walk in both with their heads held high, and they taught those children that courage is not the absence of fear but the choice to act rightly despite it. And sometimes on quiet evenings Sarah would tell her children and grandchildren about the day she and their father stood bound and beaten but refused to break, and about the old soldier who remembered he was human first and a soldier second, and she would say that this is what she wanted them to remember above all else. That kindness is a choice we make every day, and sometimes that choice is easy and sometimes it costs us everything we have, but it is always worth making, because at the end of our lives what matters is not how much we accumulated or how many battles we won, but whether we treated our fellow humans with dignity and respect. And that the world is not divided into good people and bad people, but rather into people who choose good and people who choose evil, and that most people are capable of both, and that what separates them is often just a moment of decision when they must choose between what is easy and what is right. Her grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, and ask if she had been afraid, and she would answer honestly and say, "Yes, I was terrified, but fear is not the enemy. Courage is not about having no fear but about choosing your path despite the fear, because some things are worth standing for even when standing costs you everything." And they would ask about Thomas Webb and whether she ever saw him again, and she would say no, but that she often wondered about him and hoped he had found peace, and that his moment of courage had rippled outward in ways neither of them could predict, because that is how courage works. It spreads from person to person like light spreading from candle to candle until the darkness is pushed back. The story became part of the family history passed down through generations, and each time it was told it carried with it a reminder that we are all capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, and that the world we create depends on which impulse we choose to follow in the thousands of small moments that make up a life. And Sarah lived long enough to see her great-grandchildren and to know that her choice to stand firm that day under the desert sun had become part of something larger than herself, a testament to the idea that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered, and that love and belonging are worth any price. When she finally passed into the next world, she did so surrounded by family, and she went peacefully knowing she had lived according to her principles and had never betrayed the people who had taken in a broken stranger and made her whole again. And her last words were about gratitude for the unexpected grace that had entered her life when she needed it most. And somewhere, perhaps in another place, an old soldier named Thomas Webb also passed peacefully, knowing that on at least one day in his long career he had chosen right over wrong and had helped two people find their way back to love and home. And perhaps that is all any of us can hope for in the end, to look back and know that at least once we stood for something worth standing for and made the world just a little bit better than we found it.